Oh, there we go. Right, well, good afternoon. G'day. My name's Chris from the Australian National University in Australia. I'm presenting some research that I've done with my supervisor and the eyes that prioritise the issues for green industrial policy. Okay. So first I'll just go through the outline. If that was the word for me. Nope. Just flip the screen plus. Perfect. Okay, so I'll just go through the motivation behind this research, outline our definition of what we believe green industrial policy to be, why we need to prioritise, the broad framework we use to guide this multi-criteria analysis, a variation of it, the overview of our method, the guiding principles behind this, dimensions, and final results. So first and foremost, the motivation behind this. So globally, we know that policy can be a strong driver of change. Strategic decisions need to be made when it comes to policy, given resource constraints, finance, or human resource constraints. This is especially so for climate policy today. So green industrial policy, what is it? Leading on from climate policy, form of climate policy. The main focus of green industrial policy is to improve two facets in industry, both the economic facets and the environmental. So an example of them, there are some broad green industrial policies like the US Inflation Reduction Act, and there are some much more narrow ones like Chile's 2020 hydrogen strategy. So the more narrow ones, the ones we're looking at in this. We can see that in recent times, there's been a lot more policy and scientific production of green industrial policy. And for our case study in particular, we're looking at EDF, so embedded accounting frameworks. So what an embedded accounting framework is, it's a framework that allows you to provide credible information about the emissions that are embedded in industrial products. The example that we're using is for the Australian government's guaranteed origin scheme. So the Australian government has developed this for hydrogen and renewable energy industries. They've come to us and they've said, they came to us, about a year ago and said that they want to expand this into other industries. But before expanding, they want to know where they should target. So the main reason for this is the fact that there are quite a lot of financial constraints, both in terms of the money they can put into the project, as well as the money it takes to create it, and also the human resource constraint. So in general, a lot of these green industrial policies and policy in general needs a lot of prioritisation. When it comes to making these decisions on prioritising an industry for inclusion in an embedded emissions account framework, takes in monetary and non-monetary factors very widely, and sparse factors are very different. It's also quite a subjective thing to do to create a piece of policy. And industries have strengths and weaknesses in different areas, especially when you're comparing these directly, it's quite difficult to do. However, we know that governments and international organisations do this all the time. For example, Australia and the US have come out with a compact that has identified green metals and hydrogen as a critical area for our relationship. However, academic literature on these prioritisation strategies and approaches is quite porous, and particularly the principles behind the fundamental principles behind what means an industry or a piece of policy should be prioritised. So that's the main focus of our research, was trying to come up with these fundamental principles that we call dimensions in this research, and then trying to find a more objective way to rank industries and policies for creation in the future. So in our general method, the requirements of what we needed from this framework to make it a bit more objective, this compute multidimensional and combating factors into a holistic ranking. We need to prioritise industries based on multiple stakeholder values. So let's try and average over that subjective factor that comes in with policy creation. It needs to be simple and transparent, public dissemination of this knowledge, but also for understanding of climate advisors without a technical background, to be able to understand when we come to these, or how we got to the final numbers. And also it needs to relate all the industries within succinct boundaries and to manage the uncertainties in the data that we're using. So what we ended up going with was a variation of multi-criteria analysis. So I'm sure a lot of you have already seen or heard of this before, so I'll give a brief overview. It's a decision-making framework for complex choices that allows you to break apart a complex problem into manageable components so that you can analyze them quantitatively and qualitatively. And it's also very supportive for transparency in decision making. It's a very brief example, just so you can visualize it. We're trying to pick a car. We've got three options there: a family car, a sports car, and a Formula One car. You come up with your criteria of what you think is important for a car. You can ignore the priority weights at the top for the time being. From there, you'd be collecting your data values on each of the criteria. But a big problem once you've got this is how you're going to be able to compare your $100,000 with $30,000. So that's where you need to be able to scale your scores for it to all be comparable. So if we go into the scaling and weighting, for our method, we mainly stuck with global and local scaling. So global adds more subjectivity to this decision-making process, as you need to decide upon a minimum and maximum theoretical value, and then you're normalizing your value within that. You can normalize it linearly or following different functions. We've stuck with linear normalization, because we didn't think we needed to go any further than that. And then local scaling is doing the same, except you're setting your worst score and your best score is 0 and 100 or whatever scores you normalize in between. So again, I'll skip through these on time, but those are some examples of doing it. So getting back onto the priority weights, and trying to have this is more objective decision instead of setting, all right, I believe cost should be 20% of the importance in this framework. We went through and we used a pairwise comparison. So pairwise comparison is a way of coming up with priority weights through matrix transformation. So it's a more mathematically rigorous way of doing it. But the good thing about pairwise comparison is that it's very simple to do. Basically, all we're doing is we're taking a one-on-one comparison between two criteria or two dimensions, and you compare them with, I think, criteria 1 is more important than criteria 2. From that decision, you're then weighting the importance on a scale of 1 to 9. How important do you think it is compared to the other option? And then, again, it's been widely used in a lot of academic areas, so I won't go into the mathematics behind it, but the key thing of importance here is just the need to maintain transmissivity for the logic of it. So the variation that we use for multi-criteria analysis is the analytical hierarchy process. It's basically just a form of MCA where all we're doing is you're setting an additional level of the hierarchy. So you can see that we can imagine the first dimension here could have been costs from that last example, but then you're separating out the reasonable prices from costs into separate things like potentially the cost of the car, cost of maintenance, cost of criteria. The main reason we went with this is that it's very useful when there are a lot of different criteria. It avoids a flat importance weight distribution amongst the criteria. It's also quite effective for communication of the information at the end, which is it's hard to visualize now, but in the final slides it should be shown. A general overview of our method and how we went about it. First, we defined the dimensions for green industrial policy prioritization. So these dimensions, which I'll show on the next slide, we think are fundamental for all green industrial policy. We then went on and we identified the products for inclusion. So what industries did we think we should run through this and collect data for? It's quite a time-consuming process. We could have just do it for all industries in Australia. Then define what the nested criteria were underneath each of the dimensions in consultation with Australian policymakers. In making this decision, these criteria were become a bit more specific to the piece of policy that we are prioritising for. We then administered pairwise comparison surveys to these decision makers to try and understand what was of most importance to the Australian government. We then identified each industry's score for their values for each of the criteria, and then we went on to compute the final results. So the overarching dimension, so again, this is what we believe overarching for green industrial policy. There are 5 of them. The first one being the emissions relevance of the industry. So this is the extent to which inclusion of this industry in a piece of green industrial policy would help reach national and international greenhouse gas reductions. The economic relevance, so this is aiding in maintaining or accessing international markets. So something I skipped over that I just remember now is a key thing, especially with the economic relevance that I'll get onto in the guarantee of origin scheme, so on a better emission framework, is that it allows an industry to have access to these international markets by certifying the emissions associated with them. So for example, someone from Australia trying to sell cable into Europe would have to go through the Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism. So by having this global piece of information that the policy provides, that opens up these international markets and green premiums. The third one then was policy relevance and alignment. So is it supporting national policy? Is it underneath international policy that will affect it? The fourth one was the technology readiness. So the technology readiness dimension captures how soon an industry, how close an industry is to decarbonise. And the fifth dimension we went with was regulatory burden. So how difficult is it to create this piece of policy? Underneath it, I'll go through these quickly. These are the criteria that we have underneath each of the dimensions. To reiterate, these are the criteria that we thought were applicable to our specific prioritisation case. They can still be used for other ones, but obviously if you're prioritising piece of policy in your own country, you have separate criteria or slightly different criteria. So for example, in emissions relevance, we've got percentage of emissions from the Australian industry. So we're including an industry that has a high proportion of Australian emissions. Obviously, it's going to have a large effect on our national greenhouse emissions, which should be prioritised. For economic relevance, you see percent of Australian GDP. That captures more of the socioeconomic measures and the influence that the industry has within the nation. Policy relevance and alignment, we've gone with whether or not the industry is included in our major trading partners' pieces of policy, whether they're current or under development, and whether or not the industry is aligned with Australian green industrial policy priorities. Technology readiness, from its namesake, technology readiness level of the national scale. So just looking at whether or not it's in the research, development, or commercialization stage. And also the percentage emissions reduction of the best method. So is the best method actually reducing emissions that much? And finally, regulatory burden. So how difficult is it to create this policy? You'll notice these two, hydrogen potential and renewable energy potential, those cover the fact that the GeoScan has this certification scheme been created for those industries. So those industries, renewable energy and hydrogen, or within the supply chain of the industry we're prioritising, that reduces a lot of workload. So moving on to the results. The importance weight of intervention. So this is from pairwise comparison. A brief outline of the graph. Each of these little dots is one of the individual policymakers' priority weights for that given dimension. The 9 policymakers were in Israel, local and shown up. And then the blue bar is the aggregated priority weight. I really like the note in this graph, but you can see how subjective something like policymaking is. It's an equal thing in Australia, the Department of Climate Change, Environment and Water. And yet you can still see there's quite a lot of change. So this is one of the main reasons that we try to bring in this is to find a way to average over this and make it a little bit more objective. We're going to do some further work in this, but include some more industry experts, more quality experts as well. So moving on to what the most important criteria was. So those were mentioned. I won't show you the graph of criteria, but the most important criteria that we came across for emissions relevance, it was the percentage of Australian emissions from industry. The economic relevance is the 2030 market potential. For policy relevance and alignment, it was alignment with Australian green industrial policy priorities. The technology readiness was the technology readiness level. And for regulatory burden, it was international framework development. So it was assisting enabling countries in developing frameworks like this. The overall framework, so this is then multiplying each of the dimensions importance by the criteria importance. The most important for the overall framework was the technology readiness level. Then it went down to emissions reductions of best method, Australian emissions, 2030 market potential, and percentage of global emissions from global industry. So on to the final slide now of the prioritisation scanning. You can see the 9 industries that we decided to put through prioritisation scanning. And so the most important here for us was methane. So in the natural gas sector. This is the graph that I was alluding to before that allows for the transparent communication on each of the levels. So because it's separated into separate hierarchies, we're able to assess each industry based on separate dimensions. So we're looking at emissions relevance here, even though the industry is ranked in fifth position. Beef is quite by far and away in Australia the most emissions relevant industry that there is to be assessed. So based on this information, the Australian government has announced expansion into green metals and low carbon fuels. It's taking alternative multi-stakeholder approaches to agricultural products, such as beef and wheat. It's quite difficult to create these pieces of policy for those, as you can see from the quite low scores in regulatory burden. And finally, we think that our research shows rational decision-making conditions for subjective criteria, and trying to make policymakers in representing it in a more transparent. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Thank you so much. Talk about this slide you're showing with the histogram and the dots, the exits of yeah.
Right.
So, right there. So I was wondering, is there a way that in your application of the atmospheric radiation analysis to account for the scale of variance in under different?
Yeah, so I didn't include it in this, and we only did a very small version of it due to time constraints that we had. But a general sensitivity analysis, I think you're alluding to. We did a general sensitivity analysis over this, and we actually had more than 9 policy and industry experts that completed this. I think we had around 20 from memory. The reason we couldn't include those is they didn't follow the transitivity measure within pairwise analysis, so there was slight logic errors in 1 or 2 of their decisions. But they weren't outliers necessarily. It was just the fact we didn't want to include it because they had slight logic errors in 1 or 2 decisions, and we thought 9 would be enough because when we graphed it with all 20, it actually did show they were clumped in quite close to the results that we got here. But yeah, certainly further sensitivity analysis on this would definitely be required.
So if my understanding right, then would you analyze the ones that are the biggest areas?
Yeah, potentially. That's a good idea. We hadn't thought about that, but I'll take that on board. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I was curious. So you decided to use the hiring process, right?
Yeah.
When the first came you said you just considered to choose government or was industry or community for industry?
We looked through a few. In general, we were going to go with the multi-criteria analysis because the Australian was reasonably set on moving in that direction. I think they initially wanted to just use a strap plate, a flat multi-criteria analysis, but we ended up going with the analytical hierarchy process, mainly for the communication, but also to avoid the flat distribution because we put it all through without the hierarchies and we ended up with very similar percentages between each of the criteria. So in the end, there was no point even coming up with the importance weightings. So yeah, we were reasonably set based on our constraints. Yeah.
Was interested in what role that technology maturity scales called technology readiness, which is a bit different. It has to do with the alignment of the technology with market constraints and ability to move quickly into penetration. So it's like the next step.
Yeah. We did Sure. Okay, we didn't necessarily start. I think we somewhat captured it in percentage of Australian exports, in that if it already had access to these exports and as soon as they're transitioning into it, they've already got a market to transition into. But for the emerging industries that we had in there, and I guess green steel on its own could be an emerging industry from steel itself. No. But yeah, again, great point, thank you.
All right, we're still fairly good in time, so thank you very much again. We'll move on.